Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Impact of GDPR webinar provided by Beta Distribution and iStorage. My name is Kevin Jeffcoat. I'm really happy to have you along this afternoon, and we're going to be spending approximately the next 45 minutes to an hour going through exactly what the impact of GDPR is on your business. What's really interesting, and we've probably all seen this over the last 5 years or so, is there's a tremendous amount of growth. Until I actually put this slide together, I hadn't realized exactly that zettabytes existed. I started out in the floppy disk days, so for me it was 1.4 megabytes. So you can imagine I've seen a huge amount of data growth over the years, which is really of interest. But what it means is the fact that going forward, we're going to continue to have this exponential growth in data. And you can see the growth and where I was, just reminiscing on my floppy disk days. So what this means is that there's more and more data coming into the world on a daily basis. And if there was an economy that was growing, it would be the data economy. And it's often referred to now that data is the new gold, because there's many people out there that really want to have that data, make access to it. So it's important that we recognize the security side of our business and really do all we can to protect that data. If you look at some of those numbers, 2.5 million cybercrimes reported. This came from a local regional organised crime unit. So we work very closely at iStorage with a number of police forces, and they share this information. Hopefully we'll have it updated for 2016. But still, 2.5 million cybercrimes reported in 2015, and that's only 28% of businesses actually reported the attacks. So there's a large number of attacks actually going unreported. The costs, well, you can see as the data's exponential growth, the costs and the impact, and that's because we all become more and more reliant on that data. It doesn't matter what our business involves, but somewhere along the line there's actually data that's going to be precious to us, and we need to maintain that. But the cost to the business has gone from 27 billion pounds sterling to 49 billion, and the average cost is somewhere between 1.46 and 3.14 million pounds. So organisations are really understanding what cybercrime is doing, and it's really important that we look at how we protect our data. Just some further facts for you, give you an outline of some of the things that we face. So this actually came from an organisation called ESET, who make drive security software. 12,500 handheld devices were lost in taxis just in London and New York. So just think for a second, where's that latest unprotected USB drive that you had, and is it still in a taxi? UK dry cleaners, 22,000 USB drives are found every year. So again, working probably in a suit, leave the USB drive in your suit, take it to the cleaners, there goes your precious data. Globally, more than 20 million unprotected USB drives are lost a year. I'm going to repeat that number, 20 million unprotected USB drives. When I say unprotected, they haven't got any secure, either software or hardware security. So they're just all basically regular USB drives. And 1/5 of people finding a USB drive will use them. So for organisations that are looking actually to get into the data, one of the ways that they can do that is proliferate a car park with a few USB drives, and hopefully someone will pick one up, decide to plug it in. The moment it's plugged in, they've got access to the system, because there's data that they can then filter onto the PC or onto the network, and then they'll use that to work their way around. But they're into where they wanted to be. They've got access to the system. So USBs, how do you lock them down? How do you protect that from happening going forward? And then finally, every week, 140,000 hard drives crash in the United States. That's a tremendous amount, but look at the impact actually on the data. 140,000 hard drives, probably averaging somewhere in the region of 1 terabyte. That's a huge amount of data that's being lost or not being able to be recovered. So it's really important that you back up and keep this information secure. And then this one is more related to the working environment. And the loss of data is on the ever increase. So how much sensitive corporate information you're leaving exposed by keeping information on USB flash drives, for example, that again are unprotected. The threats continue to grow. 500 million new viruses, 3,000 DDoS attacks, and 500,000 phishing attacks. I'm not going to go into too much detail of that, but I'm just trying to set the scene here of what we've got to do with GDPR and what that means to us in how we protect ourselves. Here you can see on a small chart, this actually comes from the ICO. This is the number of incidents reported and the split by business. So our health is under more pressure than just with its patients. It's also one of the largest exposed areas for internet and theft crime. So it's really important that we target some of these areas. The question, it's not if, but when. And I think everybody needs to understand that it will happen. It's not going to be the person next door. It is likely to be you that is exposed to this cyber crime. So one of the reasons that GDPR has actually come into force is to give us that bit of protection. And one of the leading things that you'll find as we go through the slides is it's driven more towards us as personal people and the personal privacy more than from businesses. So what is this general data protection regulation? The key here is regulation, and by that it means it will be enforced. It is a law. It's not advisory. So people will be looking come May 2018, the 25th of May, they'll start to look to make sure that organisations across Europe are compliant. The regulation requires that all public sector and private sector organisations, and as it says there, in fact, anyone that holds personal data, I'll come on to the definition of personal data a bit later on, but across the 28, and again I'll cover that in a moment, currently it is 28 EU member states, but within that everybody needs to comply. So whether you're a one-man band business or a multi-million global business, this is a regulation that will apply to you if you have any personal data. I can't think of anyone that's in business that wouldn't have some personal data on someone, so everybody is under this catch-all. It also applies beyond the region in the sense that if you have a business operating, let's say, for example, in the United States, but you have European customers, you need to also comply to GDPR. So it really is a wide-reaching regulation. And the reason being behind it is to give the EU a greater uniformity of standards. So right now in the UK, we have our standards provided by the ICO, the Information Commission's Office, and Germany, France, Italy have their own standards. From the 25th of May 2018, this brings in line one single regulation that everybody will then comply to. I said I'd cover the 28 European states. So Elizabeth Denham, Information Commission Officer for the UK, has provided a quote. I'll paraphrase it for you, and effectively what she's saying is that the GDPR is a law that we need to abide to in the UK. So even once we've triggered the Brexit, that will be a year post May when it could come into effect. So we're looking at May 2019 before UK's on its own with regards to regulation. But she's actually stated very categorically that once we're outside of that, we will actually comply to either equal or an equivalent or even further control, because she understands just how important it is to the global economy. So however you look at it, pre or post Brexit, GDPR is an impact on every UK business and European business, but more importantly UK, because it's not going to go away post the Brexit campaign. So looking at the cost of data breach, the current maximum that you can get fined with the current regulation is 500,000. It moves to what I consider an eye-watering 20 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is the greater. Just to put that in perspective, recently Tesco's I think it was Tesco's Bank, suffered a breach. Were GDPR to be in effect today, the cost of their data breach would have been somewhere around $1.97 billion. So it really is a huge impact. So when you're considering what the effort is required to actually become GDPR compliant, it certainly isn't as much as it is in terms of turnover-wise, the cost and the impact if you actually suffer a breach post 25th of May. So let's actually now look at the GDPR itself and understand what the key considerations are. Here's where we started, the official journal of the European Union. It's really all about providing privacy protection, and it's more importantly for us as individuals. It will address contemporary privacy challenges. So we all know there's also been recent legislation passed with regards to data privacy and e-privacy. GDPR looks to level all of that and make it a level playing field going forward. So all of those areas are combined and everybody will have to comply. And it's hoped, and I say hoped because I've just mentioned those eye-watering fines are obviously huge, but the impact firstly will be some investment required, but long-term administration burdens, as you're only dealing with one legislation across all European sites and not dealing with multiple data protection authorities, the cost should actually be massively reduced. Why have we had the need for reform? Really, when you look at the document, and I urge anyone to take a read of it to get yourself familiar, but the key objectives are to harmonise, as I said, to give one law across the continent, to get those 28 member states all under one law or regulation. And it will replace the current directive 95-46-CE. So at the moment, that only covers the UK. This, as I say, will go European-wide. The theory behind it is it's evolution, not revolution. So everybody's working towards a legal framework that will enable current economic and technological contexts, the growth of that data, as I expanded on earlier, the fact that data is booming. We need to make sure that we've got something in place to be able to contain that and work with it. The enforcement side is actually more from the personal user, so it gives you more control as an end user of your personal data. But it also reinforces the powers of national data protection authorities. So the ICO will have more powers under the regulation. So it broadens what they can and what they can't do. And then from a company's perspective, it's really going to hold them accountable in the sense that they can't blame somebody for not having the right processes and people in place. So companies have to be able to demonstrate compliance, and one of the new obligations that falls heavily on what they're classing as data processor controllers or officers, so DPCs and DPOs start to be held accountable for all of the GDPR regulation. So it needs to come from top down, it needs to be driven from the C-suite all the way down through the IT section and then percolate out through the remainder of the business, because it will be everybody's responsibility to understand how they manage their data going forward. I said I'd give you a brief outline of what personal data is, and I'll expand on this further. But the directive outlines the requirement of the appropriate technical and organisational methods. So it talks a lot about process. It talks about, here in particular, the pseudonymisation and encryption, and I'm going to labour the point of encryption. iStorage obviously is completely involved in encryption of data. So for us, Article 32 is one of the reasons that we're here talking to you this afternoon, because this regulation has huge impact in the sense that Article 32, as you can see in the highlighted area, maybe not as clearly here, but that is actually copied directly from the regulations. And as I say, it states quite categorically that for personal data, it should be pseudonymized and then encrypted. So the two come together, and certainly give you some insight to encryption and how we can do that later. What constitutes personal data? The first line says it all for me. It's any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, so us as a data subject. We can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, identification number, location data, or online identifier. So one of the areas that really is quite open at the moment is online, automatic processes by how we manage data, people coming onto a website, perhaps using social media or another form to log in. That's an online identifier. How do we capture that information? Where do we store it? Obviously, then you can move on to the more specific factors of physical, psychological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social, or the natural person themselves. So it really does start to open up all elements of the data. And that personal data, as I said, has to be pseudonymized, so it has to be given a separate name and lost within, sorry, not lost, and held within the system so it doesn't get lost. And people actually have to know exactly where it is. One of the things that's just open again in terms of greyness is there is no legal definition currently of anonymous data, so that's going to have to be tightened up before the regulation comes in. So watch this space and we'll have some more information on exactly what anonymous data means. So looking at the regulation that's in place today, these principles apply. So there's still lawfulness, fairness, transparency. There's purpose and the limitation of that, data minimization, accuracy, how we actually retain the information, and the one that I'm focusing and involved there is the data security. So these all exist and are principles of how we should protect data today. However, GDPR has taken it one stage further, and it's the point I made earlier when I talked about data protection officers or data controllers. So accountability, and this is where organizations are actually going to have to demonstrate, show line by line, exactly how they've detailed records and the data processing activities. So going back to that website scenario, someone logs in with a social media, they need to be able to make sure they can identify that person, but pseudonymize and store them away securely by encryption, but at any one time be able to retrieve that record as well. Here we talk about the appropriate technical and organizational methods. So a lot of information that's stored is there's going to have to be processed as to how it's stored, how it can be retrieved, who can have access to it. Currently, I know within our organization, databases, whilst we try and consolidate them, elements of them get extracted and forwarded by email. Going forward, we have to make sure that they're all completely locked down and centralized and stored away so that that can't happen. So, of course, there's got to be processes in place to enable that, even to extend it to mailing out softwares. So if you've got a central database and you use a software to a Comcast or a MailChimp equivalent, that data has to then still be centrally managed and organized. So there's a lot of information that needs to be contained. Conduct a privacy impact assessment, so understanding exactly what the data is and how it needs to be kept private, and again, even the processes that go behind that. Implement privacy by design, so even things like walking into your doctor's surgery, these things have actually now got to be done in a way where database records are designed to be as discreet and not give us any information away. So if anyone walks away from a screen and someone looks over the top, they actually can't see who's just walked in and logged in. They can't get in their details, which I know from personal experience sometimes happens. I've even heard of passwords being shared across the corridors, which isn't particularly good. The regulation also asks for a data protection officer to be appointed. This is quite key in the sense of someone maintaining total responsibility throughout the organization for exactly that, the data and the protection of it. We mentioned the implementation of the GDPR in terms of being a EU regulation, and also touched on the fact that if you're based in America with European clients, you would also have to comply. Likewise, you have to implement some form of method when transferring that data outside of the EU boundaries. So for us, as an example, we provide portable data storage that's completely encrypted, can go in your suitcase, briefcase, and you could transfer it safely in the knowledge that your data is secure and no one's going to have access to it. And then they're looking still for close cooperation with national protection agencies. So we know Elizabeth Denham has highlighted that post-Brexit we'll still work very closely with the GDPR regulation and Brussels to make sure that the UK complies in all aspects of the regulation. So the data security, this element again highlights specifically for us, and the reason we're here this afternoon, talking about the GDPR is that the controller and the processor shall implement the appropriate technical and organizational methods to ensure a level of security appropriate to risk. So going back to that data privacy and the data impact assessment, this is where you need to break down exactly what data is relevant to GDPR, who can have access to it, who needs to take control of it. So once the DPO has been appointed, there are people then, so as an officer, data protection officer, he will then, in a large organization, likely have both data controllers and data processors. So back in the old days of typing pools and passing information across, that sort of process needs to be implemented again, so you understand at any one point where data exists and how you can have access to it. Within that, they need to ensure that this pseudonymization and encryption exists. So from an iStorage perspective, and I don't want to make this into a sales pitch for sure, but I just want to highlight the fact that all of our products in the range are fully hardware encrypted and further protected by PIN authentication. So you'll see right at the very end when we say all of our products will enable you to become GDPR compliant, it's because we provide encryption. And I'm sure you can talk to your account managers here at Beta Distribution and understand exactly what requirements you have, and they'll be able to service you with the appropriate product. Moving on from encryption, I just mentioned about the PIN authentication. It's really important that this information is stored securely and encrypted, but also there's confidentiality and strong integrity. So we stand by, as a broad encryption level and security level, we would use military grade encryption across all our devices. And that gives you the resilience that you need. And it's for systems, not just the devices, so every part of the network. The ability to restore. One of the things that we'll touch on in a while is the fact that people have this right to be forgotten, which means they need to be removed completely from your system. So once a record's been archived, you need to have a process in place to be able to access that personal data, and of course it's got to be in with a timely manner. And that could be as a result of a physical, so a loss of a device, or a technical incident, so going back to those early slides, a cybercrime, a hack, someone trying to get in through a back door, in through a hub or another format just to get the information. So physical could be the device, and technical could come in over the internet. And then finally, a process of regularly testing, assessing and evaluating the effectiveness of technical, so that would be our function, making sure our bit works, and the organisation measures for ensuring security of processing. There's lots of discussion points here where the security of processing, people will have to be monitored, make sure you've got the appropriate security measures in for staff, so people become really key, and also those processes. I can't stress enough that it is all about processes and people in terms of making sure that you're actually secure, the final P being protected with the pseudonymization and encryption. Okay, I mentioned it, the right to be forgotten, so another article quoted here. This is really one that is a little bit grey, particularly when it comes to social media, because if you're appearing in someone's timeline or on their Facebook page, how do you go about actually getting erased, and actually whose responsibility do you actually go to? But effectively, if we think about it just in a business case, the right to be forgotten, I have an account with a certain company, and I decided I don't want to use them anymore, I have the right to ring them up and say, please put me in touch with your data controller, and he or she has to erase the data. Again, a little bit open here is how much information has been passed on to third parties, and making sure that those data links, and I'm thinking again probably more in a social media context of how your data's been shared, your name's been tagged in somewhere. LinkedIn as a classic example of that one, perhaps for a business case. It could be that the data subject, like I just said, I've rang up and said I want to withdraw my consent for you to have my information, so I have to get access to it quickly. And the other thing is that there has to be a period of time where you actually say now that the storage period has expired and the records no longer exist, and then destroy and provide proof of actually the destructions of the records. Going forward, as I say, it's a bit of a grey area in terms of some of the specific rules. So the right to be forgotten is one of those that remains up for grabs during the next sort of 12 months, but certainly really important to understand how it fits into the sort of wider context of GDPR. Privacy governance and documentation. An organisation with 250 people or more must appoint a data protection officer. The regulation does away with the requirements that now exist in many countries for all controllers to register their data processing activities. So this is where I say that the burden comes in terms of keeping things slick across the Europe region. Right now in the UK, we would have to provide information to someone operating in France if we're sending information across, how they would actually put that into their system. So on a large scale, companies that span Europe with offices and networks really have a headache making sure that each data processor controls it in accordance with each law. Going forward, that's removed. The other thing is that, as I said many times, processing and the handling of that information has to be fully documented. And if there's any suspect of breach, that document has to be made available to, well, in our instance, it would be the ICO. So the ICO would come along and ask to inspect and make sure that the documentation, the policies and the procedures are all in place and you are taking good care of that data. Finally, the data protection impact assessment. So this is really where you have to go through all of the information and understand where the high and low risks are and working throughout the business to actually understand how you're going to take a process through the business so that you're not actually open to any specific risks. Okay, looking at the summary of where we are with general data protection. It's regulation and it's not legislation, so it will be enforced. The date of compliance, etch this somewhere, 25th of May 2018. The regulation requires all public and private sector organisations, in fact, anyone that holds personal data across the current 28 EU member states, to comply with the regulation. So there's no hiding. And as I stated earlier, EU regulations promise greater uniformity in standards and hopefully reduction in costs. When it comes to providing the range of storage products, we have the ability to go through a complete range of products from portable data storage up to the desktop data storage, ranging from 4 gigabytes all the way up to 8 terabytes. So as you can see in the top right hand corner of your screen now, we're quite happy to put a mark of compliance there, that because of encryption, because of PIN authentication, you can be sure of being 100% GDPR compliant. Okay. So guys, I think we're going to try and take a questions and answer session now. Does anyone have any specific questions of what I presented this afternoon? All right. Matteo, you have a question?
Hello.
Hello, Michael.
So I'm 20 minutes in.
I've sent. Hi there.
Hello.
It's Christian Colton here. I've asked if we can have a copy of the slide deck.
Yep, certainly.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Anyone else other than Christian would like a copy of the slides? If you can flag your interest now, that would be good.
Yes, please. John Schofield from Integra.
Yes, please. Andrew Henshaw from Maplin.
Yes, please. Matteo from Intergo.
Thanks, Matteo. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, can I ask a just general question? Any feedback on the content?
From my perspective, quite clear, simple to understand. Excellent, really.
Thank you. Does it help you take your business forward?
Can I just ask when these products will be available?
They're all available now.
Okay.
So the range is listed within beta.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions at all? Okay, if there's no further questions, guys, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thanks for listening in. And we'll certainly be making some follow-ups with both the slides, and if there's any further information you require, please contact your beta distribution account manager, and we'll be more than happy to pass you on any information.
Thank you. Very useful.
Okay, thanks so much for your time, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.